Buckle up, folks. We're going time traveling, taking a trip back to 1960s UK to see how they lived compared to us now and what it meant for their health. Sort of like opening a time capsule. But instead of old photos and stuff, we're looking at everyday habits and trends.
Yeah, and the real gold we're after is insight. Not just for nostalgia's sake, but to see if there are any clues from the past for living healthier today.
We've got a bunch of articles comparing life then and now. Plus, we'll hear from Dawud. He's a health and well-being coach. Oh, and get this. This might make you spit out your tea. Back in the 60s, obesity in the UK was only around 2%. Today, it's a massive 28%.
Whoa, that's not just a little change. That's a huge difference.
So our mission on this deep dive is to figure out WHY. What changed so much between then and now?
All right, let's set the scene.
Okay.
Imagine 1960s UK. Traditional families, dad at work, mom at home. Now, we know this wasn't everyone's reality, but it was pretty common back then. Fewer cars, way less processed food. If you wanted a burger, you were making it from scratch.
Yeah.
And that home-cooked reality, that was a major difference. No supermarkets packed with ready meals. You ate what was in season, and you cooked from scratch.
It wasn't just the kitchen, though, right? Think about jobs back then. They were a lot more physical.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And even chores were like a workout. No fancy dishwashers or robot vacuums doing the work for you.
Exactly. Physical activity was just part of daily life, not something you had to schedule in. And for kids, playing outside wasn't an activity. It's just what you did. No screens to compete with.
Wow. Can you imagine a childhood with no smartphones or constant entertainment? It makes you think, did they even know what boredom was?
Maybe not. At least not like how we experience it now. And if we link this back to our obesity puzzle, it starts to make sense. People were burning way more calories without even trying.
Makes sense. So we've got this picture of the 1960s. But how did we get from there to here? To understand that, we found four main things where things really shifted: time, activity, food, and mindset.
Think of these as the four pillars, holding up this massive change in how we live. Each one's connected to the others. And by looking closely at them, we can start to see how those little everyday choices added up to something much bigger.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with time. As we move into the late 70s and early 80s, there was a big economic shift. Dual income households became the norm. More women were entering the workforce. Social norms were changing. And the cost of living was going up. All of that played a part.
Right, and that had a knock-on effect on the time available for things like cooking. Suddenly, those big home-cooked meals weren't so easy for lots of families. The stage was set for convenience to become really important.
Makes sense. And that's where the food industry swoops in, right? With a solution.
Yeah.
Processed food. But it wasn't just about filling a gap. Our sources say they actually targeted busy families, marketing these products as time savers.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not just that these foods existed, it's that they were being pushed as the answer to a modern problem.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a small thing. This was a wave of new products, packaged in a clever way, and designed to appeal to a generation that wanted convenience. Think about those early microwave meals, the promise of a hot dinner in minutes.
It's wild how those early convenience foods weren't just a new way to eat, they were subtly changing our expectations about food and time.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just happening in the kitchen. Remember all that manual labor we talked about in the 60s? Well, as technology got better, jobs became less physical. More desk jobs, more machines in factories, even at home.
Right. Makes you wonder, did people even realize this shift was happening, or did it feel like progress, like making life easier?
That's a really good question, and it gets to the heart of how these changes often start with good intentions, but have unexpected consequences. We traded physical effort for convenience, and while that made life simpler in some ways, it also chipped away at the activity level that people used to have just by living their lives.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got time being squeezed and activity levels dropping. Let's talk about the food itself. In the 1960s, you had stuff like Spam and corned beef, sure. But the amount of processed food we have now, that was unheard of.
Totally different world.
Today's supermarkets are full of ready meals, sugary drinks, and snack foods, all made to taste good and last a long time. But not necessarily to be nutritious. It's like a totally different food landscape. And as we said before, the food industry's marketing was really powerful, especially in the 80s. They weren't just selling products. They were selling a whole way of life, a promise of ease and enjoyment.
And it worked. These easy, tasty foods became totally normal. And our sources point out how portion sizes started to get bigger too.
It's amazing how it all comes together. We've got time, activity, and now food all changing in ways that weren't that healthy. But there's one more piece of the puzzle.
Mindset. It's the subtle but powerful force behind our choices. And back in the 60s, it was pretty different from today.
Okay, tell me about this 1960s mindset. What made it so different?
Well, think about it. Life back then, for many people, was all about necessity, working hard, making do with what you had. And physical effort was just part of life. It wasn't about finding the easiest or most pleasurable option. It was about getting things done.
So it's not that people in the 60s were naturally better or more health conscious. It's that their whole life encouraged different habits.
Exactly. And as convenience became more available, as technology started to give us shortcuts and instant gratification, our collective mindset started to change. We began to put ease and comfort first, sometimes at the expense of effort and long-term well-being.
It's really interesting to think about how these shifts in time, activity, food, and mindset all combined to create the perfect conditions for the health problems we see today. But before we get too deep into those, let's go back a bit and focus on that key turning point. The 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, that's where these changes really took hold, and the dominoes started to fall, setting the stage for the world we live in now. Okay, so before we jumped into those four pillars, time, activity, food, and mindset, we talked about life in the 1960s. Now let's zoom ahead to the 70s and 80s, a time when those shifts really picked up speed.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, picture this. It's the late 70s, early 80s. Disco's on its way out, shoulder pads are in, and families are feeling the pinch. Living costs are rising, and for many families, both parents, working becomes less of a choice and more of a necessity.
Right.
And this isn't just about money. It's a big change in how families work.
Correct.
Those traditional roles start to blur as more women join the workforce.
Yeah, definitely.
And what about those home-cooked meals, the ones that used to be so common? Suddenly there's less time, less energy, and a lot more pressure on families to find quick solutions.
Right, because everyone's working more.
Exactly. And that's when the food industry really steps in. But it's not just about filling a need. It's about actually shaping what people want. Our sources point to this period as the start of really clever marketing aimed at busy families.
So it's not just that convenience foods were around. It's that companies were pushing them as the answer to this modern problem of not having time.
Precisely. And they were incredibly successful. Think about those first microwave meals. They weren't just offering a new way to cook. They were selling a whole new way of life. The promise of a hot, home-cooked meal without spending hours in the kitchen.
Yeah, it's funny how those early convenience foods were almost like a gateway to the world of processed food we see today. They made the idea of quick fixes seem normal, and they started to change what we thought a home-cooked meal even was.
I see what you mean. And this was happening at the same time as another big shift, the rise of all those labor-saving devices. Remember how we talked about manual labor being normal in the 60s? Well, in the 70s and 80s. Technology started to change everything.
Right. Microwaves, dishwashers, washing machines, all those things designed to make life easier.
Exactly.
But did all that ease come with a hidden cost?
It's a classic trade-off. Those time-saving gadgets also meant we were doing less physical activity. We weren't standing over the stove or scrubbing floors anymore. We were pressing buttons and letting machines do the work.
Interesting.
And this wasn't just at home. It was in the workplace, too. More desk jobs, more automation in factories, all contributing to this gradual decline in how much we moved our bodies.
Right.
Even leisure time started to change. In the 60s, kids were outside all the time, climbing trees, riding bikes. But in the 80s, the Atari had landed, and Nintendo was about to take over the world. Screen time became a big competitor for active play.
Wow, that's a big change. It's almost like those early gaming consoles were a sign of things to come, how technology would end up shaping our lives, and maybe even our health.
I think you're right. And while all this was happening, the food landscape was changing too. Remember those limited processed food options from the 60s? Well, the 80s saw a huge explosion of new products, sugary cereals, snack foods designed to be super addictive, all kinds of stuff.
It's like someone opened the floodgates.
Yeah, exactly.
Supermarkets were suddenly overflowing with these colorful, convenient, but highly processed foods.
Right. And the marketing was really clever.
Yeah.
They weren't just selling products, they were selling an aspiration, a whole lifestyle. Think about those classic 80s commercials with catchy jingles and images of happy families enjoying all these new foods.
It's amazing how they tapped into this feeling that everyone was stressed for time and offered a solution, wrapped up in a package of convenience and fun.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about individual products, it was about normalizing a whole way of eating. Fast food chains like McDonald's
Yeah.
became hugely popular in the 80s, making eating out cheaper and easier than ever.
So you've got these families, both parents working, no time, surrounded by ads for convenient foods, and fast foods everywhere.
Yeah.
And really paints a picture of how those healthy habits from the 60s started to disappear.
Yeah, it all adds up.
So what happens next?
Well, as we move into the 90s and beyond, these trends just get stronger. But we'll save that part of the story for after a quick break. Stay tuned. Things are about to get even more interesting.
Okay, so we've traveled from the 60s, where being active was just part of life, to the 70s and 80s, where convenience started to change things. Now let's jump ahead to the 90s and beyond to see how these trends kept going and what it all means for us now.
Right, if the 80s were about planting those seeds of change, the 90s were like pouring on fertilizer and sunshine, all those trends we talked about. Dual income families, processed foods, technology, they didn't just keep going, they went into overdrive.
Yeah, like the 90s were the testing ground for how we live now.
Exactly.
We saw the internet take off, computers in pretty much every home, and a whole new way of working, shopping and entertaining ourselves.
And those desk jobs, they became the standard for a whole new generation. Suddenly, sitting for 8 hours a day wasn't just for some people, it was practically what it meant to be an adult.
And for kids growing up then, screen time went from something new to just part of life. Video games got more and more intense. The internet opened up this whole world
Yeah.
of digital stuff. And those early gaming consoles, they led the way for smartphones and tablets.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about kids staring at screens. It was a fundamental shift in how we interacted with the world, from playing outside to being in these really stimulating digital environments.
It makes you think, did we even realize what we were losing? That connection to nature, just playing without a plan, all those chances to move our bodies that were just built into being a kid.
It's a good question. And as these digital worlds were growing,
Yeah.
the food landscape was changing too. Remember how processed food started getting popular in the 80s?
Yeah.
Well, in the 90s, it was everywhere.
It really was. Supermarkets became these massive places full of quick and easy options, all these different ways to feed ourselves and our families. But were we really nourishing ourselves or just filling a hole?
That's the tricky thing about our food system now. We have more choices than ever before. So much food. But a lot of it is made for taste and to last a long time, not necessarily to be healthy.
Right, like we've become experts at having a lot of food, but maybe not such good food.
Exactly.
And our sources say this isn't just by chance. The food industry has gotten really good at understanding what we crave, how much we want convenience, and they've built this whole system around taking advantage of that.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's not necessarily about being evil. It's just that the system is set up to prioritize profit and efficiency over health and well-being.
And that system has become a big part of our culture.
Absolutely.
So we've got all these things happening at once. Sedentary lifestyles because of technology, a food environment that encourages us to eat too much processed food, and this constant pressure to do more, be more, achieve more. It's no wonder we're seeing so much obesity and chronic diseases.
Like we've traded being truly healthy.
For living longer.
Right.
We might be living longer now, partly because of medical advances. But are those extra years good years? Are we really healthy and happy?
That's a question Dawud thinks about a lot. Remember, he's that health and well-being coach.
Right.
He sees how these lifestyle choices affect people. And while he knows it's tough, he's also really optimistic about our ability to change.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, he believes that even small changes, made consistently, can have a big impact. It's not about changing your whole life overnight. It's about shifting your mindset and building habits that support your well-being.
So what can we do? How do we deal with all this and get healthier? What lessons can we take away from this trip through time?
I think the first step is just being aware, understanding how we got here, recognizing those subtle shifts in time, activity, food, and mindset. That can help us make better choices.
So it's not about feeling guilty. It's about having the power to choose.
Exactly. And remembering that small changes done over and over again can really add up. It's like those tiny drops of water that eventually carve out a canyon.
That's a powerful image. It's encouraging to think that we can change our habits, improve our health, even when it feels like the world is pushing us in the opposite direction.
I agree. And we don't have to do it alone. There are resources, communities, people like Dawud who are there to help us on our health journeys.
That's great. So as we wrap up our deep dive into how health and lifestyle have changed, Let's leave our listener with something to think about. We've looked at the past, we've seen the challenges, but most importantly, we've seen that change is possible. Now it's time to take what we've learned and put it into action.
I like that.
Even one small step today, like choosing water instead of soda, taking a walk at lunch, cooking at home instead of ordering takeout, that can be the start of something amazing. A journey towards a healthier, happier you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration. We hope you found it insightful and, most importantly, empowering. Remember, the past doesn't have to dictate the future. We all have the power to create a healthier tomorrow. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep